Trying to decipher a botanical key without knowing the proper terminology is like trying to nail jello to a tree. And since one of the primary goals in this course is for you to be able to use a key when confronted with unfamiliar trees or shrubs, you'll first have to learn some terminology. What about the term dendrology? Dendro means tree, and ology is the study of, so dendrology is simply the study of trees, and in our case shrubs. Commonly included in this study are identifying characteristics, ranges, principal uses, and growth habits and characteristics. Both trees and shrubs are classified as woody plants because of their woody stems. But what distinguishes a tree from a shrub? Shrubs are woody plants growing close to the ground, with multiple stems and low-hanging foliage. Trees are woody plants at least 20 feet tall at maturity, with a single stem or trunk and a distinct crown. With these definitions, it's easy to classify most woody plants as trees or shrubs, but, as with most general rules, there are bound to be difficulties. For example, vine maple can grow to over 20 feet in height and have a more or less distinct crown, but since it almost always has multiple stems, it's generally classified a shrub. On the other hand, species such as the pinyon pines and the junipers often fail to reach 20 feet in height, but since they normally have distinct crowns and single main stems, they're most often classified as trees. In spite of these minor confusions, it's usually fairly apparent whether a woody plant should be called a tree or a shrub. Trees and shrubs are categorized in a number of ways, often being lumped into groups described by opposing terms, such as evergreen deciduous, conifer broadleaf, softwood hardwood, and gymnosperm angiosperm. While all of these terms could be used in a discussion of the differences between Douglas fir and Oregon white oak, the terms are not interchangeable. They do have distinct meanings when used correctly. Evergreen and deciduous, for example, refer to the length of time a particular plant holds its leaves. On evergreen plants, green living foliage is present year-round. Individual leaves live longer than one full growing season, but of course they do eventually die and fall from the plant. Most people associate the term evergreen with needle-leaf plants such as this pine. However, some broadleaf plants, like Pacific madrone, are also evergreen. In the case of Pacific madrone, its leaves generally remain on the tree for 14 to 18 months, barely long enough to be considered evergreen. The leaves of deciduous plants fall off at the end of one growing season, which in temperate regions corresponds with winter, but in many tropical regions corresponds to a dry season. Normally, people think only broadleaf plants, such as this vine maple, are deciduous. But several species of needle-leaf plants, such as the larches, are also deciduous. Not all woody plants are easily classified as either evergreen or deciduous. A third term, persistent, is used to describe a condition in between the two. Persistent leaves die at the end of the growing season, like deciduous leaves, but persistent leaves remain on the tree until the following spring, when they're pushed off the twig by newly emerging growth. Bur oak is one example of a tree that has persistent leaves. It should also be pointed out here that probably just to confuse students learning to identify plants, the term persistent may be used in a slightly different way. In its broadest sense, persistent simply means lasting longer than normally expected. Therefore, leaves that die but remain on the tree over the winter may be termed persistent, as just pointed out. At the same time, the leaves of broadleaf trees that remain green for more than 1 year may also be termed persistent, since they last longer than the one growing season normally expected of broadleaf deciduous trees. In effect, trees that are evergreen, regardless of whether they're broadleaves or conifers, are often said to have persistent leaves. The conifer broadleaf pair of terms is somewhat inconsistent because it uses a fruiting body, a cone, on one hand, and a leaf characteristic, broad, on the other, to group woody plants. Nonetheless, it's a very commonly used classification. Conifers are cone-bearing plants, like the spruces, firs, and pines. They generally have needle-like or scale-like foliage, and woody or leathery cones. As you might expect, broadleaf plants, or broadleaves as they're commonly called, generally have leaves that are broad and flat, like the maples. Although these distinctions may seem clear enough, there are numerous exceptions. For example, some broadleaf plants have leaves that are so narrow that they're almost conifer-like, while some conifers, such as Pacific yew, have fruits that are not cones. Therefore, there may be confusion even with this categorization. The terms hardwood and softwood are also commonly used, but again can be somewhat misleading. As you might expect, the terms describe the relative density or the hardness of a tree's wood. In common usage, however, these terms have been expanded to refer to whole categories of trees, regardless of the true density of their wood. For example, conifers are generally referred to as softwoods, while broadleaf trees are labeled hardwoods. Although this classification generally holds true, there are many exceptions. Cottonwoods are broadleaf trees and are therefore classified as hardwoods, but the wood of cottonwood is softer than that of western juniper, which is a conifer and therefore classed as a softwood. Technically, the terms that should be used instead of evergreen deciduous, conifer broadleaf, and hardwood softwood are angiosperm and gymnosperm. These are the terms used in most botanical keys. The basic difference between the two is that angiosperms have their seeds enclosed in ovaries, while gymnosperms have naked seeds, that is, seeds not enclosed in ovaries. To understand these definitions, it's necessary to understand the sexual reproductive mechanisms and organs in plants, beginning with the flower. In angiosperms, the flower has four major parts: petals, sepals, stamens, and pistils. Sepals and petals are leaf-like appendages that form separate rings around the floral cup. The inner ring of often brightly colored petals is termed the corolla, while the outer ring of sepals is known collectively as the calyx. This yellow poplar flower shows quite clearly the orange-colored petals that together form the corolla, and the all-green sepals that collectively form the calyx. Another ring of appendages sometimes exists below the calyx. This ring is termed an involucre and consists of one or more whorls of small leaves or modified reduced leaves known as bracts. The flowers of oak trees have involucres that stay with the floral cup throughout the development of the fruit, eventually forming the cap on the acorn. Within the circle of sepals and petals, two more sets of appendages are usually found. The central set consists of one or more pistils, while the outer set consists of numerous stamens. Stamens are the pollen-bearing, or the male organs of the plant. They consist of a stalk, or filament, and a head, or anther. It's the anther that actually contains the pollen sacs. Pistils are the female organs of the plant. They consist of a stalk, or style, a head, or stigma, and an ovary, which is the part containing the seeds in the angiosperms. Pistils may be either simple or compound. A flower with all four of these principal parts, stamens, pistils, sepals, and petals, is termed complete. If any one of these parts is missing, the flower is termed incomplete. A flower with both stamens and pistils regardless of whether it has sepals or petals, is termed perfect. If it's missing either stamens or pistils, it's termed imperfect, regardless of what other parts it might have. A complete flower, since it has both stamens and pistils, is always perfect. An incomplete flower may also be perfect if the parts missing are the petals or the sepals. However, an incomplete flower would also be imperfect if it were missing either its pistils or its stamens. Imperfect flowers can further be classified as being either staminate or pistillate, depending on which parts are present. A flower with only stamens is termed a staminate flower, while one with only pistils is termed pistillate. Flowers often occur singly or by themselves, but perhaps just as often they occur in a cluster or inflorescence, of which there are many different types. The inflorescence of Pacific dogwood is a concentrated cluster of flowers called a head. This head of flowers is surrounded by 4 to 6 conspicuous petal-like bracts in Pacific dogwood. Other types of inflorescences include corymbs, as in the rhododendrons, panicles, as in Pacific madrone, and racemes, as in bigleaf maple. Definitions of these and many other types of inflorescences can be found in your key or almost any botanical text. Two similar types of inflorescences, particularly common in describing woody plants, are raceme and amint. A raceme is an inflorescence having a long central axis, with flowers attached along it on stalks of equal length. An amint is like a raceme, with flowers clustered along a central axis, but an amint is always unisexual, having staminate or pistillate flowers, but not both. And in an amint, the flowers are always sessile, that is, they do not have stalks or petioles. You should also be aware that the term catkin is equivalent to the term amint, and that the two are used interchangeably. Flowers are one of the first steps in a reproductive process that culminates in a young plant. The next step focuses on the fruit, or the seed-bearing organ of the plant. The ovary in an angiosperm contains the ovules, or seeds of the plant. Once fertilized, the ovary matures, or ripens, into the fruit of the plant, still containing the seeds that are now mature. Fruits of plants, as we all know, can take many forms. Some forms may be unfamiliar to you, while others may be very familiar. Let's take a look at several types we're likely to encounter on woody plants in North America. Apples and pears are known as pomes, fleshy fruits with several seed chambers that develop from compound pistils. Berries are many-seeded fruits in which the seeds are embedded within a pulpy body, such as in blueberries. Tomatoes are another example of true berries. Although they're called berries, the fruits of blackberries, raspberries, and strawberries are not berries in the technical sense of the word. Actually, they're aggregate fruits arising from compound pistils. Drupes are usually one-seeded fruits with a hard inner wall and a fleshy outer wall, as in this plum. Although they look like berries, the fruits of Pacific madrone are also drupes. So you see, it's not always easy to correctly categorize what you're looking at. Other simple fruits include those classified as dry indehiscent fruits, such as achenes, samaras, and nuts. Indehiscent means not opening along predetermined lines or sutures. The opposite of indehiscent is dehiscent. Achenes are one-seeded, indehiscent, unwinged fruits, sometimes having hairy, tail-like appendages. The fruits of gray rabbitbrush are tufted achenes. Samaras are also one-seeded, indehiscent fruits, but samaras are winged. The fruit of vine maple is a double samara, two samaras joined together at their heads. Nuts are hard, one-seeded, indehiscent fruits with woody or leathery walls, often partially or wholly surrounded by husks. The fruit of an oak tree is an acorn, a nut capped by an involucre. There are also dry fruits that are dehiscent. These include legumes, follicles, and capsules. Legumes are dry, dehiscent fruits that split along two sutures, the product of simple pistils. The fruit of Scotch broom is a legume. Follicles are also products of simple pistils, but they only split open along one suture. The fruit of ninebark is a follicle. Capsules are products of compound pistils, and they split along two or more sides. The fruit of Pacific rhododendron is a capsule. All the flowers and fruits discussed to this point have been the products of angiosperms. They all result in seeds surrounded by ripened ovaries. But what about gymnosperms? We all know that pines have cones, but few of us ever stop to look at the seeds themselves. And even fewer of us ever notice the flower-like structures that give rise to these cones and seeds. Not true flowers, these flower-like structures are called strobili. A single structure is called a strobilus. A strobile is always unisexual and can therefore be classed as staminate or pistillate, but not both. You'll remember that angiosperm flowers could be staminate, pistillate, or a combination. Of course, female strobiles develop into cones that, when mature, have woody, leathery, or semi-leathery scales. Male strobiles generally drop from the tree soon after spreading their pollen. Each fertile scale in a female cone bears one or more naked seeds. Scales may be either spirally arranged on a central axis, as in the western hemlock cone on the left, or alternating in pairs at right angles, as in the Port Orford cedar cone on the right. This latter arrangement is referred to as decussate. When a cone is closed, the portion of the scale that's exposed is called the apophysis. Apophyses often have characteristic shapes or colors that greatly aid in identifying the tree to which they belong. In all cases, cone scales are separated from one another by bracts. In some cases, like Douglas fir, these bracts have unique shapes and are useful aids in identification. Although most gymnosperms are conifers or cone-bearing plants, there are several exceptions. For example, yew trees bear fruits called arils, rather than cones. Arils consist of a fleshy appendage, partially or wholly surrounding a single naked seed. Now that you have a clear understanding of the differences between angiosperms and gymnosperms, we can move on to other identifying characteristics important for trees, beginning with leaves. When leaves are used to classify plants, all facets of their physical observable structure can be used, including arrangement, texture, shape, margin, and surfaces. First, the parts of a simple leaf. Although the terminology for leaf parts is the same for angiosperms and gymnosperms, the terms are generally used in reference to angiosperm leaves. A complete leaf consists of an expanded portion called the blade, a stalk called a petiole, and sometimes leaf-like appendages called stipules that arise at the base of the petiole. The blade is usually divided down the center by the midrib, an extension of the petiole. The edge of the blade is known as the margin. If the leaf has a petiole, like the tan oak leaf on the left, it's termed petiolate. If it has no petiole, like the Oregon ash leaflet on the right, it's termed sessile. There are also compound leaves, in which the petiole does not become the midrib of a single leaf blade, but instead serves as the point of attachment for many additional blades called leaflets. The section of petiole to which the leaflets are attached is called the rachis. If leaflets are attached along either side of the rachis, then the leaf is termed pinnately compound, as is this ash leaf. If the end of the petiole is the point of attachment for all the leaflets, Then the leaf is termed palmately compound, as is this horse chestnut leaf. One of the most important attributes of leaves for the purposes of identification is the way they are arranged on a twig or branch. Arrangements in angiosperms can be alternate, with one leaf per node, opposite, with 2 leaves per node, or whorled, with more than 2 leaves per node. A node in this case refers to the spot on a twig where leaves or other appendages like flowers or fruits are attached. The arrangement of leaves on a twig can be further described by 2 numerical expressions, phyllotaxy and rank. Although the actual definitions of these terms are difficult to express in words, the concept behind them is simple enough. They both describe the number of rows of leaves you can see when you look down the barrel of a twig. Phyllotaxy is always expressed as a fraction. The numerator represents the number of complete spirals made around the twig in passing from one leaf node, past each successive node, to reach the node in a direct line above the initial one, while the denominator represents the number of nodes passed in the spiral just made, counting only one of the 2 nodes directly in line with one another. You may want to stop the tape here to think about this for a minute. Phyllotaxy is most often used for identifying deciduous plants in winter when leaves are not present, but it can be used in the summer as well. 3 common phyllotaxies are shown here. Stop the tape to make sure you can calculate phyllotaxy. Rank is simply a shortened form of phyllotaxy. It's used to describe the number of rows of leaves or buds seen when looking down the barrel of a twig. The number used for rank is the same as the denominator of the phyllotaxic fraction. If you have any trouble with these terms, check a detailed botanical glossary, or see your instructor. Now that the various types of leaf arrangements have been described, let's look at some other characteristics of individual leaves or leaflets. The arrangement of veins, or conducting tissues, on the surface of the leaf are often diagnostic for particular species. In describing patterns of veination, the terms pinnate and palmate are again used. Red alder has pinnately veined or pinnaveined leaves, while bigleaf maple has palmately veined leaves. Another term describing veination is arcuate. Arcuate veins are moderately curved or arced and are nearly parallel. Snowbrush leaves, for example, have arcuate veination. Another characteristic of leaf surfaces is the presence of observable hairs. There are actually many types of hairs, each with a distinct name, but often these are all grouped under the single term pubescence. Tomentum is one of these specialized types of pubescence, which is commonly used in dendrology. Tomentum refers to soft, dense, woolly hairs, as on the underside of some rhododendron leaves. Since this rhododendron has tomentum, it's described as being tomentose. A leaf surface lacking hairs is termed glabrous. Some leaves may also be glandular, that is, they have glands. Glands are often keys to identification, as in the cherries, all of which have conspicuous glands on the leaf base or the petiole. Leaf margins are also useful in identifying plants. A margin that's regular and unbroken is said to be entire, like the margins of California laurel. A margin that has sharp-pointed teeth, or serrations, that point toward the apex or tip of the leaf is said to be serrate. The margins of this cherry leaf are distinctly serrate. A doubly serrate margin has small teeth on larger teeth, as on this leaf of Sitka alder. If the leaf margin is indented significantly toward the midrib, but not more than halfway, as in this yellow poplar, the leaf is termed lobed. A lobed leaf may be either palmately or pinnately lobed, depending on the orientation of the lobes. If the leaf margin is indented over halfway to the midrib, as in this evergreen blackberry, terms such as cleft, parted, and divided are used to describe the margin. These definitions are not always strictly followed, however, and often the terms are used synonymously with lobed. For example, bigleaf maple leaves are often termed palmately lobed, despite the fact that the indentations often exceed the halfway point. Leaf margins may also be rolled or curled under, as they are in red alder. Such margins are termed revolute. Sometimes leaf margins, like those of the Oregon grapes, are tipped with spines. The term describing this characteristic is spinose. Leaf shape is also used as a diagnostic characteristic in keys, but care needs to be taken to use shapes only in a general sense because of the extreme variability that may exist within a single species, as shown within these snowberry leaves. There are many terms used to describe leaf shapes. A few commonly used in forestry include deltoid, which means triangular in shape, as exhibited by this black cottonwood leaf; cordate, which means heart-shaped, as illustrated by this redbud leaf; ovate, which refers to an egg shape that has the broadest point below the center of the leaf, as in this poison oak leaflet; and lanceolate, which means lance-shaped, as in the leaves of some willows. Leaf shape is determined by the shape of the apex and the shape of the base, both of which have their own distinctive terminology. For example, the deltoid leaf of black cottonwood could be described as having a truncate or cut-off base and an acute or an acuminate apex. An acute apex is one with an angle less than 90 degrees, while an acuminate apex tapers to a long, narrow point. Again, there are many such terms used to describe leaf bases and apexes. Definitions of these terms are available in most basic plant or tree identification books. The leaf characteristics just discussed relate primarily to angiosperm leaves, those of the broadleaf plants. Although some of the same characteristics occur in gymnosperm leaves, a different set of descriptive terms is used because of the difference in appearance between the two types of leaves. Three basic leaf arrangements occur in gymnosperms, or conifers. A spiral arrangement in the conifers is analogous to the alternate arrangement found in the broadleaves, in that there's one leaf per node. A decussate arrangement in the conifers is analogous to an opposite arrangement in the broadleaves, in that there are two leaves per node. However, in a decussate arrangement, the orientation of the leaf pairs switches 90 degrees with each successive pair. Decussate arrangements occur in both conifers and broadleaves. However, in the conifers, the leaves are often oppressed or flattened against the stem, as they are in these fall cedars, making the decussate arrangement in conifers doubly difficult to see. A ternate arrangement in the conifers is analogous to the whorled arrangement in the broadleaves, in that there are more than two leaves per node. However, a ternate arrangement will always have 3 leaves per node, as in this western juniper. A special type of spiral arrangement occurs in pines, whose needles are generally borne in bundles of 2 to 5 needles. Such bundles are called fascicles, and the arrangement is termed fascicled. There are 4 basic leaf shapes in the gymnosperms. Acicular leaves are long and needle-like, as those of the pines. Linear leaves are also narrow, being many times longer than they are broad. A distinction between linear and acicular leaves is that linear leaves have sides that are nearly parallel, while acicular leaves converge at the apex. Leaves of the true firs are linear. Awl-like leaves are also narrow and are several times longer than they are broad, but awl-like leaves taper to a long, sharp point. The leaves of common juniper are awl-like. Scale-like leaves are very small, overlapping, and closely oppressed to the twig. In addition, they're often arranged in flattened sprays or branchlets, as in incense cedar and the other fall cedars. The margins of acicular and linear conifer needles are generally either entire or irregularly and finely serrate. The tips of such needles, however, display quite a diversity, with the most common types being rounded, pointed, acuminate, or marginate, which means notched. Looking closely at the tips of needles often aids in accurate and quick identification. Another diagnostic characteristic likely to occur on any plant part, not only on leaves, is the presence of a waxy coating or powder called bloom. A plant part covered with bloom is termed glaucous. If bloom occurs on a leaf, it's often associated with the leaf stomata, minute openings in the leaf surface through which gas exchange takes place. In such a case, the bloom is termed stomatal bloom. Note, however, that not all bloom is stomatal bloom. Let's look now at the woodier parts of both the angiosperms and gymnosperms, beginning with the twigs. A spur shoot is a twig which has undergone little elongation, so the leaf scars all butt together, giving a lumpy appearance. Larches and true cedars have their leaves clustered on spur shoots, as do many of the common fruit trees, such as cherries and apples. Another characteristic of twigs that's most obvious on angiosperms, but occurs on gymnosperms as well, is the leaf scar, which occurs where a leaf was formerly attached to the twig. Leaf scars often have distinctive shapes that aid greatly in identification, both in the conifers and in the broadleaves. Within a leaf scar, small bundle scars are often visible, indicating the point where the vascular bundles entered the leaf from the twig. Some twigs, especially in angiosperms, also bear characteristic lenticels. Lenticels are corky growths, often shaped like a double convex lens, that aid the plant in breathing. Lenticels often have diagnostic shapes and colors that by themselves can help you identify the plant. Besides irregularities like lenticels, there are a number of other structures that may occur on a twig. The most common are probably buds. Buds are embryonic growing structures enclosing scale leaves, immature leaves, or unopened flowers. Buds are often covered with protective modified leaves or stipules known as bud scales. If no scales exist, the bud is termed naked. If scales do exist, they may occur in several different forms. If they're overlapping, like shingles, they're termed imbricate. If they meet together along their edges, they're termed valvate. And if there's a single scale covering the entire bud, the bud is said to be capped. Of course, there are many other terms used to describe bud scales, but these are three of the ones most commonly encountered in dendrology. A bud may also be classified according to its position on a twig. A terminal bud occurs on the end of the twig, while a lateral bud occurs along the sides of the twig. Both lateral and terminal buds are present on this Douglas fir twig. Other structures occurring on twigs include spines, thorns, and prickles. If a twig or branch has any of these structures, the twig is said to be armed. Spines are modified leaf tissue. There are, therefore, traces of vascular bundles in spines. In cacti, all the leaves have been reduced to spines. A thorn, on the other hand, is a pointed branch, usually sharp and stout, as on this hawthorn branch. A prickle differs from thorns and spines in that it's a surface characteristic arising from the bark, rather than a growing structure arising from within the plant. A prickle has no traces of vascular bundles and is usually easily broken off. The stems of many blackberries and roses are covered with prickles, as are the cones of many species of pine. If the point on any of these various types of armament curves backwards, it's said to be recurved. Another distinguishing characteristic of twigs is the type of pith, or the inner core of soft tissue contained within the twig. For example, elder has a spongy pith. Indian plum has a chambered pith. Snowberry has a hollow pith. And the oaks have stellate or star-shaped piths. Often the pith alone can allow you to correctly identify a plant. Older branches and the trunks of both angiosperms and gymnosperms also have useful distinguishing characteristics, particularly their bark. On some trees or shrubs, such as manzanita, the bark peels off in shreds or thin layers. This is called exfoliating bark. Other trees have bark with longitudinal channels or grooves, such as on mature California red fir. Such bark is termed furrowed. Many species have bark that's scaly, but none quite as prominent as that of ponderosa pine, where the scales resemble pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. Some trees, particularly pines and firs, have large amounts of resin associated with the bark. Resin, also called pitch or sap, is a solid or semi-solid secretion that's usually translucent and ranges in color from clear to deep amber. When fresh, resin is quite sticky and aromatic. Resin may also occur in blisters or pockets under the bark, particularly in young fir trees. Although we've described many of the easily observable characteristics of woody plants, there are a number of other terms that commonly occur in plant keys and that therefore you need to be familiar with. Monoecious refers to plants that have male and female flowers on the same plant. Therefore, fruit could be produced on all specimens of a monoecious species. Most woody plants that you'll encounter in North America are monoecious. Dioecious refers to plants in which female and male flowers are borne on separate plants, rather than on a single plant. Since fruit only develops from female flowers, fruit will not be found on every specimen of a dioecious species. Be sure to note that monoecious and dioecious refer to entire plants, while terms like perfect, imperfect, complete, and incomplete refer to individual flowers. Some terms like pistillate and staminate may refer to individual flowers or to entire plants. Most plants propagate sexually, but some reproduce vegetatively by layering, suckering, or sprouting. In such vegetative reproduction, the offspring is the genetic duplicate of the single parent from which it arises, and is termed a clone. When a cutting is taken from a plant and grown, the resulting plant is called a clone also. Cloning is an important method of genetic improvement in some species, such as the poplars. Well, there are many other terms used in botanical keys, but understanding the terms and concepts presented in this slide tape should give you a good foundation on which to build. By becoming familiar with these basic terms, you'll be well prepared for the more sophisticated terms you'll meet later in your career.